Alrighty. So basically, what we're going to go over today is using an acronym called TWIST, and it stands for Tone, Word Choice, Imagery, Style, and Theme. And we really want to think first about what is poetry when we talk about poetry, and that's kind of what the video was talking about. Poetry is just a form of literary expression that captures intense experiences. Poetry is very creative, right? Poetry kind of has this musical language to it. So it's different than prose, like when we read a story, because it doesn't have to follow any rules. So poetry, some poetry rhymes, some doesn't. Some uses punctuation, some doesn't. They can put capitalization wherever they want. So all of the rules we talk about, like the editing rules, don't really apply in poetry because poets can do it however they want. They can use long lines, they can use short lines, they can put one word. It's just all up to them. It's very expressive. So some characteristics of poetry are obviously a line, which is just a row of words that may or may not form a sentence, and then stanzas. That's a group of lines in a poem that separate the ideas. Stanzas are kind of like paragraphs, right? So you see here you have a blue day, a blue jay, and a good beginning. So a blue day, this is an example of a line. Down here at the bottom it says, one crow, melting snow, spring's winning. This is a stanza. So you can see this poem has 2 stanzas, but it has 6 lines, right? Okay, rhyme. So when we talk about rhyme, y'all know what rhyme is, right? Cat, bat, mat, sat, those kinds of things. It sounds the same at the end. In poetry, sometimes we have end rhyme where the end of the line rhymes, like the last word, and that end rhyme kind of creates a pattern or a sing-songy effect. It creates what we call a rhythm, right? Or a beat. That's what creates meter in poetry. Internal rhyme also helps to create meter because that's when you have rhyme within a line, okay? And so it kind of creates this up and down kind of sing-songy effect to your poem. And then a couplet is just 2 lines of verse that are the same length and usually rhyme. So some poems are written as a couplet, meaning they'll have 2 lines that are about the same length, they rhyme, and then a new pattern. That's kind of that A, B, B, C, C, that rhyme pattern, okay? So word choice. Word choice obviously is very important. We talk about word choice in all types of writing. We know that words are used to communicate ideas. They're used to describe things. It's your word choice that affects the tone, right? If I'm using very silly words, it's creating a humorous tone. If I use fancy words, it's creating a formal tone. So my words are important, and words in poetry matter so much because there's not that many of them. That's why when we talk about poetry, we read poetry very differently than we read other things, right? When we read poetry, we read it multiple times because we're really trying to get a good understanding. And I'll read a line in a poem maybe 4 or 5 times before I fully understand it. But words really matter. Imagery are just those descriptive words. We've talked about this before in our own writing, right? Trying to include imagery. We talked about this when we talked about bada bing and really using our senses to help the writer. Remember in writing, we talk a lot about skin slippage, getting the reader to really slip into and feel like an experience what we're experiencing. That's what imagery is all about, right? And poetry uses lots of imagery. Figurative language is just language that communicates meaning beyond the literal. So figurative language could be anything. It could be similes, metaphors, hyperboles, anything that is creating, it's meaning something different than the actual meaning. Obviously hyperboles, my backpack weighs a ton. It doesn't literally weigh a ton. It just means it weighs a lot, right? When we've talked about figurative language, we've talked before about SMAFIO, right? Do y'all remember? And that's just getting you to think about each type of figurative language. So as you go through and you're going to be analyzing figurative language in your poems, think about SMAFIO. It's going to help you remember all the types we've talked about. Summary is just a short overview, right? You're getting the main points of something longer. You're putting it in your own words. And we talked about summaries last week when you talked about summarizing the text that you read. Maybe that was 2 weeks ago. No, I'm losing track of time. Symbolism is just a person or place that stands for something else. So let's look a little bit more in a second at symbolism, okay? Theme, obviously, big idea. What's it all about? It's kind of the core of the work, the reason. You're thinking, what is the author's message about life? When you think about theme, you're thinking about how this applies to other parts of your life. Theme is not story specific. So theme can be, hard work pays off or cheaters never win. Those are all ideas of themes. And then we have tone. Now, lots of people get mixed up. I mix this up all the time myself between tone and mood. They are very, very similar. Tone is just the attitude of the author toward the subject. So if you want to remember this acronym, Mr. Ta, it will help you. Because you see Mr. is M and R, that's mood is the reader. So mood is what is in your heart. How do you feel about what you're reading? And then tone is the author. So this is more in the head because you're thinking about what is the author feeling or what is his or her attitude toward the topic, okay? So just a way to kind of keep that straight. The words that you use to describe mood and tone are often the same, but just keeping in mind, tone is how the author feels about it. Mood is how you feel when you read it. Okie dokie. I'm wondering, hold on well, that's okay. Okay, so this is when we're getting now into twists. So all of those kind of things I was just talking about before, we're kind of giving you an idea of poetry terms, right? Just kind of reviewing some poetry vocabulary. Now we're getting into twist. So you probably want to, the things that I have in red here, you want to make sure and write down on your notes because this is the part you need to remember. And for tomorrow's lesson, you're actually going to apply this to the poem that we are reading today. That makes sense. So you want to make sure you understand what to do. So title. The first thing you're going to do is read the title of the poem, analyze it, right? Think about your schema, your background knowledge. What do you already know about this topic? And then make a prediction. What do you think the poem is going to be about? W is for word choice, right? This is the W. I'm spelling the word twist here, right? Word choice. So you want to look at any unknown word. So if there's a word you're not sure of, underline it and then try to replace it with a synonym. Think about what that word might mean. You might want to circle any interesting or repeated words or phrases, anything that really stands out to you, anything that's going to help you figure out the big ideas in the poem. The I is for imagery and any type of figurative language, right? So again, here we're really thinking about smaphio. So keep that in mind. You're keeping that smaphio in mind anytime you see similes, metaphors, alliteration, personification, hyperbole, imagery, or onomatopoeia. Those are the things you want to note. That is the author using figurative language. And the important thing to remember, guys, is that figurative language has a different meaning than what the words actually say. All text has figurative language, right? Good authors, whether they're writing informational text, literary text, poetry, they include figurative language, but in poetry, it's even more prevalent. There's tons of figurative language. Even listen to songs. When you listen to songs on the radio, wherever, you'll hear tons of figurative language where the words that they're saying don't exactly mean what the word means. They have kind of a different connotation or a different meaning. And then the S is for two things. S stands for number one, symbolism. Thinking about the symbolism. Is there a word, a phrase, or an idea that symbolizes something else, that stands for something else? You want to make sure and note that. And then you also want to summarize. That just means you're paraphrasing each stanza. So as we use close reading strategies with poetry, we're going back in, we're rereading chunks of the text very carefully, and then kind of taking notes on the side. Sometimes y'all will call this bumper stickers, right? Or just kind of annotating out to the side, just like you do when you have like a star passage or something like that. You read a chunk, you stop, and then you kind of write some notes about what that's about on the side. You're doing the same thing here with poetry. You definitely want to do it for each stanza. If the poem doesn't have stanzas, because it doesn't have to, you can just break it wherever you want. So every few lines, go ahead and stop and write it out to the side. If I'm reading a really difficult poem, I'll do it for every single line. Especially poems that are very short, They're short, but they pack a big punch, meaning they have a lot of meaning. So you might have to really, depending on how well or how well you're understanding or how difficult the poem is, you might need to stop more often. Okay, so that's both. Now, let's talk a little bit more about symbolism. We talked about symbolism at the beginning of the year, but symbolism is difficult, okay? So when we talk about symbolism, it can be just an everyday object, right? For example, a heart. A heart is just a regular object. But if I draw a heart on my paper, it means love. It can mean appreciation. It can mean I'm excited about something, right? Think about the biggest thing I can tell you for symbolism that y'all do every day probably are the use of emojis. When you're using emojis, that emoji is symbolizing something, right? A good example is the emoji that has the two hands coming together. It's supposed to be, when they created that emoji, they created it as a high five. Lots of people see it as praying hands, right? And so people will sometimes use that emoji to symbolize, like, I'm praying for you, or I'm thinking about you, or they can use it just as high five, way to go. So that one emoji has it kind of has two different meanings, right? So it's anytime we give significance or meaning to some object or event or person, you can kind of invent symbolism, okay? Here's another one, the chocolate ice cream emoji, right? I think that's what it was intended to be originally. We've kind of changed the meaning or invented a meaning to mean poop, right? I think lots of people use that, and now I think it's even become that. Really, it's kind of that meaning for it has taken over. But we're really just thinking about understanding what's being symbolized in a poem. So you know symbols if you see it coming up over and over again, okay? Think about, well, I'll show you this example in a minute from the Hunger Games, the Mockingjay, right? The Mockingjay in the Hunger Games series is a symbol. It symbolizes her kind of leading the way. And if you have to know about that bird and how it moves and how it leaves and all of that to really understand the symbolism behind the Mockingjay in that book. But it might be connected with a character or an event. For example, I'm also in the Hunger Games, and now I'm not going to remember my example, but Peeta, for example, his name is Peeta. His name, though, is a symbol because he comes from a family of bakers, right? His family are bakers. So his name is actually a symbol. So there's lots of symbolism in names, especially in literary works that you read. The names often represent something about the character. So the author will spend a long time on the description in a part that might let you know that this is symbolism. Someone unmute yourself and tell me, what is the symbol? What is the symbolism for this picture?
A peace sign.
It's a peace sign. So what does it symbolize?
Peace.
Peace. Good. Thank you. It symbolizes peace, right? We know that when we see this symbol, it's meaning peace, goodwill. Okay, what about this one? What is this a symbol of?
Freedom.
Freedom, very good. Now, the object itself is the Statue of Liberty, but the Statue of Liberty is a symbol for freedom. Okay, what about this one? Anyone?
Cancer.
Yes, it's for breast cancer, right? This is breast cancer awareness. Now, even though this is a pink one, the different colors represent different types of cancer awareness, right? And so when you see this pink little ribbon like this, it's a symbol for breast cancer awareness, right? All right, and then here's the last one. Write down this for the last T. It's all about tone and theme. So you want to think of two things. Number one, theme. What's the theme of the poem? What's the big idea? What's the passage about? And then what evidence supports that theme? And then tone, meaning what's the author's tone? How did the author feel about the topic? And how do you think they want you to feel as you read it? Meaning you're starting to think a little bit about mood, right? Because obviously tone and mood go together.